The other thing is to nationalise it, put it under government control, where the government can, though it is a monopoly, the government can keep the charges low and maintain certain standards of efficiency and provision of national service and so on. Well, in the 19th century, the Liberal and Tory governments favoured the nationalisation solution. As I've said, in America, they after a lot of attempts and giving it up and trying again and so on, American governments have favoured the antitrust solution, and you will all of you read 2 or 3 years ago, following a decision in the American Supreme Court, the American government broke up what was the biggest and richest corporation in the world, the American Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, which had got a monopoly of the American telephone service. That is the line the Americans have taken. Well, what's happened now, having had experience of nationalisation and finding that a lot of conditions have changed, the Thatcher government has decided to change its line. They still want to deal with monopoly, but they have decided that it's no use trying to deal with it through nationalisation of industries, so they have turned to the American system. In other words, the Tory government have strengthened the anti-monopoly laws and are hoping to deal with the thing in that particular way. It has an interesting sideline on this. You will all of you know that Thatcher frequently makes speeches saying that she's in favour of small companies. She wants small capitalists to thrive and or get going and try to make a do of it. Well, oddly enough, in 1921, it was the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Clines, who wrote this. He said the Labour Party prefers a large number of small capitalists to a small number of large capitalists. In other words, Mrs. Thatcher, I don't suppose she did, she could have picked this up from the Labour Party of 60 years ago. But now you can see why the Tory and Liberal governments were in favour of nationalisation in the 19th century. And apart from the postal, telegraph and telephone services, I've mentioned that in 1844 a Tory government passed an act giving them power to take over the railways. Well, what had happened, the railways had got a monopoly of transport. They'd driven the canals out of business, and the horse-driven vehicles on the roads. They could charge what they liked. They charged high prices, and they did something else that a lot of the capitalists found particularly infuriating. They would reach an agreement with a favoured customer, and they would let a particular customer use the railways at a lower cost than his rivals. Well, for all these reasons, they got together and pressed the government, and the government passed this act, which was saying to the railways, look, either you mend your ways or we shall take you over. Another interesting thing about this, it was a Tory government, but the minister who carried it through was Gladstone, who was at the Board of Trade. Gladstone started life as a Tory minister, changed over and became leader of the Liberal Party. His rival, Disraeli, started as a Liberal, changed over and became leader of the Tory Party, and it is an old English custom, as you recall, that Sir Winston Churchill started as a Tory, became an independent, then a Liberal, and ended up as leader of the Tory Party. These professional politicians carry on in this particular way. And of course, I've already mentioned that in 1921, Lloyd George and Churchill were advocating nationalisation of the railways for the reason I gave, to run them at cost as a form of subsidising British production and British exports. As regards telegraphs and telephones, both of them were nationalised on the demand of business people, chambers of commerce and so on. And what they had against first the telegraph and then the telephone companies was this. Telegraph companies, there were a number of them, were in business to make profit. They would therefore set up their telegraph offices and their telegraph lines in the places where there was a lot of traffic, around the stock exchange, for example, and in Fleet Street for the newspapers. And later on, the telephone companies did the same. They would concentrate on the towns. No telephone or telegraph company wanted to build lines out into the rural wilderness or the lonelier parts of Scotland and so on. So the business people got together and they said, we want a national service, and we want the thing to be spread into rural areas as well as the rest. And it was for these reasons that capitalist pressure was behind the government in nationalising the telegraphs in 1868 and the telephones later on. One interesting thing about this was when the telegraphs came first, and the law gave the post office a monopoly of the telegraph service. When the telephones came on, the post office took a case to court and got a high court to hold that for the purpose of the act, a telephone is a telegraph, which of course the companies opposed. It was one of these cases where the courts can use a bit of common sense and say, look, we want to cut out a lot of wasted time. Let's say that the telephone is a telegraph, and then the government post office will automatically have a monopoly of the telephone service. But of course, the other thing behind the telegraphs and the telephones was this. First, the telegraph companies were merging together and approaching a monopoly, and later on, the telephone companies were merging together and approaching a monopoly in the national telephone service. So they had this reason that they did not want the telegraphs or the telephones to have a monopoly. And so, like the other things that the Tory and Liberal governments did, this fight against monopoly, they all fall into line. This was the thread that ran through the 19th century. But now we come with conditions different, and the Thatcher government has decided that that no longer works, and the way to do it is to use the American antitrust system, which has been the example of which has been followed in this country. Of course, in the meantime, with long years of nationalisation is not the vote winner that it used to be. There's no doubt whatever that in 1945, when the Labour Party said we're going to nationalise a whole lot of industries, it was a vote catcher for them and enabled them to win the election. But people have had a lot of experience now, and I don't think many people look at it like that. And I'll put this to you. In 1920, Sir Leo Chiozza-Money, an economist who had been a prominent member of the Liberal Party and joined the Labour Party, wrote a book about nationalisation, which was full of examples of nationalisation all over the world, and the claim that they were all making profit and so on. Well, in the latter days, of course, the outstanding feature of nationalised services, not only here but a lot of other parts of the world, they don't make profits, they make losses. And I put this to you: would anybody dream now of publishing a book with the title that Sir Leo Chiozza-Money gave to it? He called it The Triumph of Nationalisation. Well, I don't think a publisher who got out a book like that now would sell many copies. But behind the Labour Party's enthusiasm for nationalisation was a very interesting economic theory that people have paid too little attention to it. Karl Marx pointed out that rent of land, industrial profits, and interest on borrowed money are all of them part of surplus value that the capitalist gets by the exploitation of the workers. That it's just surplus value is the lot. It is divided in practice into industrial profits, rent of land, and interest on capital. In other words, if you have a factory owner who doesn't own the land and has to borrow money, he doesn't pocket all the profits he makes. He has to hand over a share to the people from whom he's borrowed money, maybe the banks or somebody else, and to the landlord if he's rented land. But they're all the same sort of things. They're parts of the exploitation of the workers. Now, the early Fabian Society, though they were not Marxist, accepted this. They said, you know, no difference, rent, interest and profit, all the same sorts of things. But later on, Professor Tawney, in a book called The Acquisitive Society, produced a new theory. He said that rent of land and industrial profits are quite different from interest. He said that interest on borrowed money is a natural and necessary feature of all forms of society, whether capitalist or socialist. And J.R. MacDonald, the leader of the Labour Party, who was their first Prime Minister, took over this theory from Tawney. Tawney had a lot of influence in the Labour Party anyway. He accepted Tawney's theory. Here is a quotation from MacDonald's book, Socialism, Critical and Constructive, published in 1929. And I quote, "When labour uses capital and pays it its market value, property is defensible." Now you see, if you take the view that rent, interest and profit are all the same, they're all exploitation, property isn't defensible. I mean, nobody can put up a defence for it. Here's Tawney and MacDonald saying property is defensible if labour uses capital and pays it its market value. MacDonald was also a leading member of the Independent Labour Party, which was affiliated to and supported the Labour Party. And here's a quotation from an Independent Labour Party pamphlet called How Socialists Would Run Industry. This was published in 1924 when there was a Labour government. "Why should not labour hire capital and devote the whole of the surplus to the improvement of the service?" And another Independent Labour Party called Socialism in the Villages said this: "There is every reason to expect that agriculture will yield a far better return to labour and capital than it now does." In other words, you've got the Labour Party rejecting entirely Marx's view about exploitation, and incidentally rejecting the Fabian Society's view of it, coming over to the Tawney view and making this queer distinction between one form of property income and another. The one thing that MacDonald and Tawney and Labour Party consistently have always said is, you hire, to use their phrases, you hire capital to run a nationalised industry, but the people who are lending you the money must in no circumstances whatever have any hand in the running of the industry, and this they have been quite consistent about it. And with one small temporary exception, there never have been any shareholders in nationalised industries who could sit on the board, have votes, play any part whatever in the running of the industry. The only small temporary exception was that London Passenger Transport Board, where one of the class of shareholders had not a fixed rate of return, but a variable one depending on the profits in the London Passenger Transport Board. And the lawyers got busy on this and said, well, if the interest they're going to receive on the money they put into London Passenger Transport Board is going to depend on profit, they've got to have some form of hold over it. And so they got written into the London Passenger Transport Board a provision for them, if necessary, if they didn't get their money, to go to the courts and get London Passenger Transport Board, as it were, declared bankrupt. And there's never been any such provision in the other industries, so to speak. Once you've got a nationalised industry, there's no existing provision, as it were, for getting rid of them, merely because they make big losses. But you see what all this means. When the Labour Party nationalised the mines, the railways and so on, when they paid £1,000 million to the ex-railway shareholders, the shareholders were then right out of the business. They had no further part in whatever. They were in no way dependent on them, and it didn't matter to them, once they'd got out, whether the coal board, the railways, anybody else made a profit or a loss. They were out, they got their money, it was absolutely guaranteed, because the bonds they received weren't charges on the coal mines or on the railways, they were charges on the Treasury as part of the budget. So you see what this means. Of course, I just want to make the point perfectly clear. If the whole of the coal mines went out of existence, the former shareholders in the coal companies would still go on getting their money. And if all the railways were wound up, the ex-railway shareholders would still go on getting their money. And as I say, in this, the Labour Party have been consistent. They've always said, you know, we'll compensate them, but we won't let them play any part in the industry once they've got out. Coming back to this Labour Party, Independent Labour Party concept of hiring capital and paying interest to the lenders, they thought it would work like this. They said the land would be nationalised, so all the rents would come to the government. The owners of the nationalised industries would no longer receive profits, they'd be compensated in getting out, so all the profits would come to the government, and the only charge the government would have in the nationalised industries would be paying interest to the people from whom they had borrowed money. Now that looks beautiful on paper, and as they saw it on paper, they thought, look, there's going to be enormous surplus coming into the hands of the government for the government to do what it liked with. They said, look, you know, we should have an enormous amount of money. We've only got one charge on it. We're going to get the profits, we're going to get the rent. We only have to pay the interest, and we should have a lot of money left over. And they said this big surplus fund should be used to improve the service, to lower the charges, and to raise the wages of the workers. That, of course, was their dreamland. But now look at what actually happened in practice. They had made the assumption that capitalist companies always make profits. They forgot all about the times, of course, when capitalist companies make losses and go bankrupt. They didn't think that depressions would ever happen again when they had accepted the old Keynesian rubbish. They thought that there was not going to be any more unemployment, no more depressions, so they ruled out the possibility that a nationalised industry could run into depression. So they were quite certain, you see, that they were going to have plenty of money to spare, and we'd be able to do all these things, raise the wages of the workers, improve the service, and reduce the charges. Lloyd's Bank, 3 or 4 years ago, tabulated all the financial returns of all the nationalised industries for the 17 years from 1961 to 1977. Now, I've told you what the dream of the Labour Party was when they nationalised. I now read out to you the reality. I quote, "The table shows that the financial surpluses of the public corporations have at no point been sufficient to cover the interest costs on their accumulating debt in addition to wages and salaries. They have therefore had to borrow growing sums to pay the interest that they could not cover from their sales revenues." In other words, instead of the government having an enormous income coming into it and only having to pay out a little interest, it's had to borrow money actually even to pay the interest, because most of the nationalised industries have run into great financial difficulties. And as I just say, that was up to 1977. In one later year, 1980, the total subsidy of the government to the nationalised industries for 1 year was £1,800 million. And as I've already explained, the only people who never had to worry about it are the former shareholders, because they were getting their money. It didn't matter to them whether the nationalised industries were profitable or not. There have been changes in the form of nationalisation. When the postal, telegraph and telephone services were nationalised, they were government departments. The staff were civil servants. They were under very, very rigid treasury control. There were treasury people, so to speak, sitting in the post office watching every penny they spent. I remember on one occasion a post office official saying to me that he couldn't spend more than £5, as it were, without getting treasury permission to do it. Slight exaggeration, but that was the sort of thing that it was. And they had a political head, the Postmaster General. Now, you often get people saying, look, why, when the government appoints a minister in charge of a department, don't they charge a man who knows all about it? I mean, why don't they put a teacher in charge of education, and a railwayman in charge of railways, and a coal miner in charge of coal mines? They don't understand the Constitution. The job of the political minister, apart from telling the departments what they've got to do and carrying their views back to the government, the job of every minister is to prevent the government from spending too much money. That's what they're there for. So it is a fact, and the post office is no exception, there has never been a Postmaster General appointed from within the post office. The Postmaster General was appointed there to carry on the treasury work of keeping down post office expenditure, because the post office surplus, as one of the revenue departments, went to the Chancellor of the Exchequer as part of his budget revenue, along with the other revenue departments, Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise. But being a government department meant that every detail of post office expenditure had to come before Parliament. Several times a year and continuously, every detail of post office estimates had to go before Parliament, where every MP could, they'd get opportunity of debating it. They could look at everything, every item of expenditure, including, of course, every item of expenditure on wages, and the wages of all the, I don't know, something like 100 different post office departments. MPs would try to burrow into these and express views about them. Then in 1930s, when the Labour Party were getting ready to come into office again and carry on a lot of nationalisation, Herbert Morrison and others pointed out to them that they could no longer run nationalised industries as government departments, because if they did, the whole of Parliament's time, all the year round, would be taken up with discussing wages and all the other things in nationalised industries. So he said, you've got to get it away from Parliament. So they invented this board system where the government appoints a board, the government provides the finance, the board is supposed to have day-to-day responsibility for running the particular department. But in all the nationalisation acts setting up these public boards, they're all of them required to pay their way, in other words, to make a profit. And the practice has existed in recent years, both Labour and Tory governments, of saying to the post office and the other nationalised industries that there is a certain target of profit they expect them to yield based on the average yield on capital in private industry. Now, because the nationalised industries are now not exactly popular, the Labour Party has decided to invent a new form and give it this new name, social ownership. And they've announced the details of it at present with regard to British Telecom, which has been privatised and has got shareholders in the British Telecommunications Company, including a lot of the staff. The Labour Party are going to revert to a form of nationalisation, and what they've said to the people who are now shareholders, we shall take away your shares, but we'll give you in return an interest-bearing security, but it will not give you any say whatever in the running of the company. Some difficulties have arisen in the past and are going to arise in the future about the nationalised industries. And they've never been solved. They concern the relationship between the public boards and the government and Parliament. I've said that in theory the boards are supposed to have sole responsibility for day-to-day operations, but all the boards, whether under Labour governments or Tories, have complained bitterly that they're continually being chased and harassed by ministers trying to interfere with the day-to-day operations, including their charges and the wages they pay and all the rest of it. And the MPs complain that whereas under the old post office form they could always raise questions in the House of Commons about post office because it was a government department, they haven't got this facility with regard to the nationalised industries. All the nationalised industry boards want to have financial autonomy to do what they like about raising money and so on, but I don't think that any government is ever going to let them have it. They've never let them have it in the past, and I can't see them doing it now. We now come to the question we put at the beginning, that when the Tories would say privatisation is good and the Labour Party would say privatisation is bad, and the question arises for us, how does it affect the working class? Look at what the Labour Party claimed when they went in for nationalisation. They said that the nationalised industry would be more efficient and more profitable. Absolutely nothing in this. I mean, a nationalised industry can be efficient, as the post office used to be. It can be profitable, as the post office used to be. Or it can be very inefficient or very unprofitable, as some of the later ones have been. Just like any private company, there is simply nothing in this. The Labour Party said that the nationalised industries would pay higher wages to the workers they employed. Right in the early days, when the Fabian Society launched this, but wrote it in terms of municipalisation, of local authorities taking over industries, they actually had a very funny passage written by Bernard Shaw. He said, look, as soon as we local authorities take over industries, they'll put up wages. But he said, well, they mustn't put up wages too much and too fast, because if they put them up immediately, all the workers employed by private companies will come on the doorstep of the local authorities wanting municipal jobs. So they have to do it very gradually. Well, if you can think back to the Winter of Discontent, for example, 1978-9, when the Callaghan Labour government was trying to keep pay increases down to 5%, when prices were going up by 10%, the people who were striking against him were 1 million or more local authority workers. In other words, Bernard Shaw's dream of the local authorities paying more than everybody else just didn't work. In the ups and downs of wages, it can happen from time to time that people in nationalised industries or in the civil service get more than people outside. Other times they get less. It's just the way the thing goes. And it can happen both ways. In the 1920s, for example, the government set up special economy committees to look into the fact that, as they said, certain industries, including civil service and post office, had got rates of pay above those in outside industry which had fallen. Whereas in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been the teachers, the health service workers, and the civil servants are all complaining that they're getting paid less than their opposite numbers in private industry. The thing can happen both ways. In the post office, right at the beginning, the head postmaster in every district used to recruit some grades like postmen at whatever he could get them to accept according to local rates of pay. Later on they set up a system by which Parliament would appoint a select committee which would take a thorough look into every detail of post office pay and make recommendations accordingly. Later on again, they came into line with the Civil Service, the Civil Service Arbitration Tribunal, and the very elaborate system of pay comparisons that was set up in 1955 and which has now been suspended. But in all these systems, you see the key factor all the time about the pay of people in the nationalised industries is what people are getting in private companies. I mean, at all these things, the thing would be argued backwards and forwards. Both sides would put in information about it. The other thing, and this particularly appealed to the trade unions, the other thing Labour Party promised about nationalisation was that it would give people job security. Well, how wrong they were. There have been hundreds of thousands of railwaymen and steel workers lost their jobs in the last 10 years, about 500,000 miners, including, by the way, the 1965 Labour government with its national plan planned to get rid of 179,000 miners. The reason being that the mines were being run at a loss. And it actually says in the plan, we are closing down loss-making pits as quickly as possible. I mean, this is something, of course, that has got to be, if nationalised industries are to be run at a profit, and if the demand changes and they're going out of business, just like any private company, they can't give job security. In the last 2 months, there have been 3 reports in newspapers about coal mines being closed down and miners losing their jobs. The first was in this country. Our nationalised industry announced last week they're closing down some mines in Scotland, and they reckon that 10,000 miners' jobs would disappear. My second example is from Japan, where the mines are privately run. They're closing down loss-making pits in Japan, and 14,000 miners are losing their jobs in Japan. My third example is from Hungary, where, of course, the mines are nationalised, and capitalism in Hungary is run by a self-styled communist government. They're closing down pits, and the miners have been told they've got to work longer hours in order to make the mines profitable. In all 3 cases, of course, it's exactly the same, that the mines are losing money. Just a glance, in the 19th century, the post office always had a queue of people wanting to get jobs in the post office. And it wasn't so much the pay wasn't particularly attractive, but it was, of course, they did have a job for life, they had quite generous sick pay, and they had a non-contributory pension scheme. In later years, of course, other industries have acquired these things, and the post office has ceased to be the attraction that it used to be. During the war,